Hello, today's video is called We're Going to Need Everything in Ontario. Today was day 12 of the public inquiry to the federal government for invoking the Emergency Act on February 2022. Today is October 28, 2022. The agenda for today is overview, key details, today's witness, and my point of view. As everybody knows, we're doing the daily summary of the testimonies in this inquiry that seeks to understand if Justin Castro had valid reasons to invoke the Emergency Act on February 14 of this year, and if the powers he used exceeded the scope granted by the Act. Based on these findings, the lead commissioner will put forward a recommendation in both English and French by February of next year. Remember, this is not a trial. All my videos can be found on my YouTube channel, Lisa Bruce Research, as well as my own website, lisabruceresearch.com. And below you can see the link for the live feed and the repository of the previous inquiry sessions that you can actually access yourself as well. Here are some key details that are useful to understand the testimonies. We all know that there were multiple jurisdictions operating on the city of Ottawa at the time of these events. So here are the key short forms for the Ontario Provincial Police, the Ottawa Police, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, police liaison teams that establish communication between protesters and civilians, very important, public order units, and the Parliament Protection Services. Here is a timeline, and here are the key locations in the map. We're going to talk today about details of the Coventry Road, and here's a list of what is required to invoke the Emergency Act. And as everybody knows, the people that are inclined to support this will use the excuse of there were violence and attempts of violence to support the invocation of the act. Today we had a witness between 9:30 a.m., 6 p.m., and obviously it was a key one because he's the ex-Chief of Police, Peter Sloly. And here you're going to see at the beginning of the examination, he was ratifying that all the sources that he was receiving were pointing to the fact that this convoy was only going to stay for the weekend, and then only very few vehicles would remain for the remainder of their stay. Obviously, we know from the report that Superintendent Morris prepared, and we heard from him on day 5. On the report, we saw that the report was stating they were intending to stay for longer, and they even have a date of February 4 in that report. So clearly, he says that all the sources were saying only the weekend, but he received the Hennon report on January 13, so there's a contradiction there. Obviously, we know from every single part of information that the risk would be to stay longer. Now, there were some intelligence gaps in multiple documents presented to him, so it's interesting how, if he is the chief of police, why isn't he looking into these intelligence gaps? So obviously that's odd. His wording throughout the testimony was inflammatory at times, and you can see here the way he was expressing himself twice. So I don't appreciate when they consistently say things like that. We want to see more inflammatory vocabulary. Here you can see how the intent of closing downtown for the second weekend was not possible because, according to him, about 2,000 officers would be required to close downtown. I don't know if it sounds like a lot of people, but maybe that is required based on the closure of roads and bridges that obviously are not only for the city, but also involve other provinces, including Quebec. Here you can see the inflammatory language. So he's talking about there were flags on cars, so obviously there are flags of Canada, I'm assuming, and then he associates this with negative things. He used the word micro things happening. Again, it's very non-specific. Systemic misogynists, systemic racism, trauma impacted on the city. So again, I don't appreciate this. Interesting. When the commissioner counselor on the direct examination asked him, how were the officers holding up after this first weekend? And then he said, this is always the tricky part for me. I am sorry. And then he cried on the stand. After he, quote, stopped crying, he said it was too much and it was too cold and they were misunderstood. There was misinformation and disinformation 24 hours a day. It was a global story and it was demoralizing for them because there was a confidence loss from the perspective of the public in the police force. I'll talk about this moment because in the beginning I thought, okay, he's being sincere, but then when I looked again, I'm not sure about that, and I'll talk about it in my final point of view. Here you can see how on February 1st, he called for a meeting with experts from 3 different jurisdictions, about 20 people in a room, and then he asked the question, tell me what is required to end this situation. And then in the end, after multiple discussions, he was told, quote, we're going to need everything in Ontario and a bunch more from across Canada. So that's the title of the video today, because obviously you can see how it's extremely big, the scope of what that would require. And number 2, that is the moment when he says, February 1st, that he understood the magnitude of the situation. Then on Feb 2, he publicly said, there may not be a police solution to this demonstration. So this was a very controversial statement, because what he says he meant is that Ottawa didn't have the resources. Obviously, we're talking about the police officers from Ottawa, did not have the resources to be able to close it. And he said that he was misunderstood, saying that people believed that he said that the police officers were giving up, which is a very different situation. I tend to believe that people may have thought, because I would think that he's saying this needs to be escalated, and it has to be escalated in a military fashion or a more drastic fashion. That's how I would understand it. So clearly, he's not very good and be precise with his wording, and you could feel that he had been advised by his lawyer to be very precise in his language, which is something that clearly he lacked in the past. Throughout his testimony multiple times, he would pause and say, I want to be precise about my words. So clearly he has learned his lesson, or at least in the stand, he appears to have learned his lesson. Because here you can see some example of imprecise language that led to confusion to the whole organization. So here you can see in writing the general priorities: close everything, roads, bridges. So if I read that in the notes and then I'm in the meeting and that's what I understood, clearly that means the 2,000 officers we just spoke about, which is not possible. So he's saying, well, this is not the plan, these were my concerns. So clearly he's not expressing himself in a concise and precise manner, which is imperative. You are directing a lot of people. This is the most delicate situation. So his lack of accuracy in the words he chose created a problem, obviously, for the whole organization and ultimately for himself. Here he's trying to explain how he stepped into a more tactical role, not as a result of trying to micromanage his people, but because there was short-staffed, and then he wanted to make sure from the strategic perspective that all his tactical teams were equipped to do whatever was being asked of them to do. I have mixed feelings about that. Here, Ferguson betrays Sloly because we have access to notes from different people. So we're going to see in a minute the multiple changes that took place in the operational commander. So here you can see Feb 1, the Sergeant Rom took notes saying that he was removed as the event commander, but he didn't understand why. And then on February 10, Ferguson said that it was at the request of Sloly. So you can imagine how this gentleman felt. Obviously, he felt betrayed by his own boss. At that time, Sloly had not resigned. So then Sloly understands, said, absolutely false. I don't have any recollection about this, etc. So here are the notes from the testimony of the Sergeant Rom. Then Bell betrays Sloly, and we're going to talk about the multiple changes on the operational commander, because that obviously created not only a chaotic situation, but most importantly, I don't understand how can you make so many changes so fast in a situation that is extremely delicate. So here you can see Feb 1, you have Riom, who was replaced with Lucas. Sloly didn't know why. Then Lucas was replaced with another gentleman, Dunlop. I don't know the titles of these people. Sloly was not informed. How is that even possible? But anyway, that's what happened. Feb 5, Sloly finds out that now Dunlop is the incident commander, in a meeting, because he attended a meeting and Dunlop was introduced as the incident commander. And that's when he realized, oh, we have a new person in charge in this situation. And remember, the incident commander is the one who's going to centralize all the operations and all the tactics in the street. So for Sloly not to know until last minute is really odd. Bell recommended him, and then Ferguson failed to properly communicate this. So remember that Bell is the current chief of police, and Ferguson is the person that was leading all the strategic operations. So now on Feb 6, you have a new incident commander, Patterson, that is the third, and in Feb 10 is Bernier, who was the fourth one, who was the final. So you can see in a matter of 10 days, you have 4 different people in charge. That's a lot. Here he's saying that someone is trying to destroy his character. He was very passionate about defending his support to the PLTs, because throughout the whole testimonies of at least 3 witnesses, Bernier, Boudouin, and even the last witness of yesterday, Thursday, we could see that Carrick, that is the highest in terms of the whole OPP, everybody has accused him of not either understanding the PLT or not supporting the PLT. So he said, I support the PLT. I've always supported it. Maybe the lingo has changed between the moment when I removed myself from the police force. I went on the private sector and I returned, but it was known to me as community engagement, but I support the PLT. I don't know. Here is something that he's saying is being subject to misinterpretation, but I think it's more manipulation. I have my doubts on certain things. So here you can see how Legal Services is saying, and these are his notes, negotiation gives us legitimacy to use force if negotiation fails. I don't know what to say about that. It just feels like an excuse to go and beat up people to me. Okay, so here's very important. This is the most important part of the whole video, in my opinion. Feb 6, everybody remembers that we have seen top-line summaries of what happened on Coventry Road when the PLT had been negotiating, but then the different protesters were arrested and the fuel was seized after the police officers had already engaged into an approval of the movement of this gas. So remember that Coventry Road is over here, about 10 to 15 minutes away from the what is called the red zone, that is downtown in front of Parliament Hill. So what happened, according to this report, is that at 4:40, the Superintendent Patterson from the OPS orders to get a hold of that fuel. And he wants to seize it because they claim that it's dangerous, etc. At 5 p.m., you have an Inspector Maran from the OPS that wants to execute the order. So in that moment, the Sergeant John Ferguson says, listen, the PLT has been negotiating with the protesters for 2 hours. I don't think you should arrest them. Just let's keep on working with the PLT. So he went outside of the incident command system because he should have called Ferguson, deputy chief. He ended up calling Chief Bell, which makes no sense because at that time he should have not been in the line of command. He supports Patterson, this order, and believe it or not, this sergeant is married to this deputy chief. I've worked a lot of years in corporate, and that would have created a huge issue. You are not supposed to even be dating the people you're working with and for. So you can see how this is clearly a very big conflict of interest. So again, that's just me. I'm sure that a lot of people will be not in agreement with me. But what is interesting here is that we won't have Patterson on the stand, the man who ordered the arrest of these protesters, because you can see here that in June, he was suspended. So really odd, that situation on Coventry Road. Now here you can see on Feb 2, a formal request to Carrick. Remember, Carrick is the highest in terms of the OPP, the man who had the highest level of authority and resources, and the one who actually think that could have solved that whole situation in a peaceful manner. And he said that Sloly always said, no, I don't want any resources. But here you see in writing that he did it, but he didn't do it under something called Section 9 of the Police Act. And if Sloly would have said, I'm asking you through the Section 9, that means that he's relinquishing control of the whole operation in the city. So obviously, this is a semi-contradiction because he has said already there's violence, there is an occupation, but then he said, well, I didn't ask for help through the Section 9 because I didn't consider it to be so serious. So you can see how when you have a contradiction in my world, you're telling me a lie to me. So I don't know. Here, Feb 7, he's explaining his double request. You may remember when Abrams was saying at the end of the call, I think they forgot I was there. And then I heard Sloly saying to the team, go and figure out how much resources you need. And if you need 100, ask for 200. You need 200, ask for 400. So obviously, Abrams put in writing to his superior saying, I felt very uncomfortable. I think that was a weird call, but this is what happened and I want you to know. So when Sloly is being asked, did you say that? He didn't deny it. He said, well, what I meant was think about long term, what you need, and think about asking this because this is your only opportunity to ask for resources. I don't know. I think that Abrams told the truth. Abrams got a 10 on 10 on my score. I don't know. The issue with aggressive tone versus mannerisms here, so you can see how here in some notes you say that Sloly, and I quote, I will crush anyone who undermines the plan. So clearly that's extremely aggressive. I can understand he was under a lot of stress. I can imagine that being in charge of the whole police of a whole city is not exactly a soft type of language you're going to use, but that's clearly aggressive. And obviously it can be taken out of context, of course. Now, we are going to proceed after the break with a direct examination, but this was with a different counselor from the commission, so this is the second part. And then it's leading to his resignation. So here you're talking about the moment when Sloly is discussing certain things with the city, etc. And then on February 14, the board chief, Diane Deans, who we saw on day 5, I actually gave her a score of 1/10 because she was allowing leaks from the board out to the public, which is something that you should not do. And she asked him at 9:30 p.m. on Feb 14, have you thought about resigning? So obviously she's asking for the resignation. He said no. And then the next morning he decided to resign because he felt that the 3 divisions, his whole operation in the police, the board, as well as other divisions, actually I should say 4 because you have the OPP, you have the board, you have the police, and you have the RCMP that are not supporting him. So that's when he decided to resign to allow the city to go forward with a plan without having the perception that he has not been able to manage it properly. Here we're talking about why were the trucks allowed the second weekend, and then he's saying, well, we have at least the need for 2,000 officers, and I'm thinking, was this a setup? I don't know. There's so many contradictions in the documents that are presented and his version of the event, so I really don't know what is happening. I don't really understand many things. Here you can see the board was calling for a lot of meetings, and at the same time they were leaking the information. So you can understand why he was reluctant to share a lot of information. In fact, there is a part that they say that the board members were taking to the streets in the cruisers. And I'm thinking, how useful is that? It just sounds like a trip, just out of curiosity. So I can understand how Sloly would feel a little bit reluctant to go into a lot of meetings. He said that there were meetings that were 3 hours and they were taking his resources as well as some deputy chiefs or sometimes one, but obviously resources for 2 or 3 hours stuck in a meeting when the whole situation needs to be solved is way too much. My point of view, I give him 5 out of 10. I feel he was set up. Definitely there's a lot of contradictions. He was very passionate on the stand. There are a lot of documents that accuse him, and I use that word in quotes, accuse him of saying things, and then he says, no, I did not. And I tend to believe when he says that. I think also it was his fault that he only scanned the Hendon report. I think that he failed to understand the scope and the importance of this event. His behavior was substandard while in duty. I think that he was very proper on the stand. He was saying all the time, thank you, and please don't allow me to interrupt you, and things like that. It was over the top. I think that he was either very remorseful or just playing a role, or maybe a combination of those. I definitely feel that he rehearsed crying on the stand, because when you cry, you don't look up. I don't know, I'm a woman, maybe I cry differently, but if I'm trying to control my crying, I would definitely not look up. I would look down, think about something else, and recompose myself. And he looked up, and then down, and then up, and I'm thinking, I don't know if it's sincere. So I don't feel it was. I could be wrong. I don't know. Under his command, I am not aware of abuse taking place. So I have mixed feelings about him, and that's why I give him a 5 out of 10. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you on Monday.